I'm going to start at the basics here and then move into a little bit more advanced stuff towards the end. The first thing you want to do is select either the portrait, shown here, or the landscape version. All the versions are the same. It says one is rotated to be landscape and one is portrait, like this one. And there's only a few different things to really keep note of in this file. The main one is the Place Art Here Smart Object. So if you double click on this smart object and then hit OK when this warning pops up, you'll be brought to this new window, and this is where you'll place your work. So you can either copy and paste, which is what I'm going to do right here, and that's Control-C and then Control-V on a PC, or Command-C, Command-V on a Mac. And something that's really important when you're placing work in here, it needs to have a transparent background, just like the object shown here. And it really helps if they're more simple objects. This particular file will turn your artwork white or whatever color you choose, so it doesn't matter what color the artwork is. But if it's too detailed and too fine, some of the finer details might be lost once it's actually texturized to look like chalkboard. So once you place your artwork in here, and wherever you place your artwork in this window is where it will appear on this particular file. All you have to do is save, so Control-S on a PC or Command-S on a Mac, and then you can go ahead and just close this smart object. You can go back into this smart object at any time. Your artwork will still be there, and you can go ahead and make changes. But as you can see, as soon as I save that, it automatically updated in this Photoshop file. So really all the hard work is already done, and now it's just fine-tuning the details if you want to change stuff around. So there are two different folders that'll help you do that. The Texture and Frames folder is the overlay texture that's on this actual type. So if I open up this folder and I turn off texture 15, which is on by default, you can tell there's no longer any chalk texture applied to this, but you can go ahead and pick whatever texture you want. And there's 15 different textures here, so there's quite a bit of versatility in terms of what the end result will look like. Some of them are more faded, some of them are a little bit louder. And also, if you have a texture selected, be careful to always leave the fill at 0%. Do not ever turn the fill above 0%. It will break how this particular file works. But you can reduce the opacity. So I move this down to 73%, and you can tell that it makes the overall texture look a little bit more faded. So you can have a whole bunch of fine adjustment by doing that. I'll leave this at 100, but you can definitely go in there and play around with that. And you can also have multiple textures on at one time for an even more faded effect. Like right here, it looks like you almost went through with an eraser and removed a bunch of the artwork. I'll turn off the second texture so we just have one on. So inside this Texture and Frames folder, there's another folder which is called Frames. It has a little red highlight to make it stand out a little bit more. You can go ahead and open that, and inside there are 5 different frames. So there's frame 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's just a little bit of extra presentation stuff. If you want to add a simple frame to whatever work you're creating, there's a few different options to choose from in here, and you can either not use a frame at all or pick whatever frame you think happens to work best for the artwork that you are using. And down at the bottom here, we have the Background Textures folder. I'll open this up, and inside there are 12 different background textures, so it's this actual chalkboard background. If you turn it off, you can see that it removes all the textures from the background except for some very light hazing from the particular frame I have applied. But you can go through and pick whatever background you happen to think works best for your project. So there's 12 different ones to choose from, so be sure to go in there and just play around with these and select whatever you think happens to work best for your project. And just like the textures, you can go ahead and reduce the opacity of these backgrounds if you want a little bit more subtle appearance. So if you want it to look like a much cleaner background, go ahead and just reduce the opacity on these files. And just like the textures, you can also turn on multiple backgrounds if you want multiple effect stacking. If you were to do that, I would recommend just bringing down the opacity on a few of these so that they're not too overbearing, they don't look too white. But you can go ahead and adjust that however you see fit. And on both of these folders, both the background textures and the texture and frames folder, there is a color overlay effect applied. To modify the color of your artwork or the background, just double click on the type that says color overlay. If you don't see those options, there should be an FX next to the folder that stands for effects with a down arrow. Just click that down arrow and then it will bring that effect up. Double click where it says color overlay, which will bring up the layer style window. And then right to the right of where it says blend mode normal, click on that white box, and then you can go ahead and change this to be whatever you want. So I'm on the texture and frames folder, and that'll change the actual color of my artwork. So if I wanted a really bright blue type and frame, I can go ahead and change that. It'll automatically change your artwork to be that color. And you can also, if you want to, just turn off the effect. So next to effects, there's a little eyeball. Just click that eyeball and that'll turn off the effect. So now the type is black, just like it was in our actual smart object. If I go back into the smart object, you can see where it's getting that color, and the frame is white. And by turning off that effect, that's how you can go ahead and use multiple different colors in your particular artwork file to be whatever color you want. Like in the preview image for this product, I actually use a couple different colors instead of all white, but the option is really up to you to do that. And you can do the same thing with the actual background folder. So if I go down to the background textures folder, double click on color overlay, bring up this layer style window again, click on the white box. I can change the background to be whatever color I think happens to work best. I do think white tends to work the best for these, but you can go ahead and make it a more subtle gray or even a bluish tone if that's something you want to do. The option is certainly there, and you can turn off this effect entirely if you want it to just be automatically reverted to white. And if you want to change the actual background color, so this is the background, I'll just make this white again really quick, the background that's behind the white overlay of texture, you can hit Control U on a PC or Command U on a Mac, hit this colorize button, and then just brighten up the lightness a little bit, increase the saturation as you see fit, and then you can go ahead and just change the hue of the overall background to be whatever color you think works best. Alternatively, you can just select a color in your fill box right here for the foreground color, select whatever color you think works best, and then hold down Alt or Option on a Mac, and then hit Backspace on a PC or Delete on a Mac, and that'll fill in the background color to whatever you selected. I'm not going to use this color, but that is another way to do that without using hue saturation. So I'm just going to change this back to black here, and then change this color overlay back to white. And the only other important thing to note here is that there is a very subtle blur applied to these objects to give it a much more worn in, chalky feeling. You can turn that off if you want to. So inside the folder Textures and Frames, there's a copy of the Smart Object Place Art here, which by the way, don't turn this layer on ever. It doesn't need to be on. It'll actually break the effect. Just leave this layer at the top turned off at all times. But it is copied down here near the bottom, just below the Frames folder, and it's called Art Don't Remove Layer. And that is an actual copy of that Smart Object up top. So if I turn it off, it hides our artwork. And then I hit the eyeball again to turn it back on. There's a Smart Gaussian Blur filter applied. So to the right of this actual layer, you'll see two overlapping circles with a down arrow next to it. Click that down arrow, and inside there, you can see a Smart Filters box and then a Gaussian Blur. Double click on Gaussian Blur to bring up the Gaussian Blur window. And if you turn off preview, it'll hide that effect altogether. So you can tell it sharpened up the actual type here. There's no more blur effect. So if you don't like the blur effect, you can go ahead and just turn the radius down to 0. If I hit preview again, you can tell there's no blur, or you can increase. A smaller number is less blur and a bigger number is more blur. So if I move this up to like 19, it really starts to wash out this type here. It becomes pretty hard to read, but the effect option is there. So you can go ahead and just fine tune this to suit your needs. By default, I have the radius set to 4 pixels, which seem to work pretty well to give it that handmade chalk feel without being a little bit too blurry. And the same thing applies to the frames. So on each one of these 5 different frames, there's an effect applied just like there was for the actual art object. So you can click the down arrow next to the frames and then go into Gaussian Blur there and change the actual overall appearance of the blur on the frame. So I have it off completely right here so you can tell the frame looks nice and crisp. And if I move it back up to close to 4 here, it looks like it did before. So you can go ahead and manipulate the blur as much or as little as you want, turn it on or off. Just make sure this preview box is checked so you can actually see what you're doing while you're doing it. And the main reason I actually mention this is because if you want to go and resize your document, because these are pretty large by default, you can go to Image and then Image Size. Make sure that your proportions are constrained, and the way to check that is there's a chain link to the right of where it says width and then height. Just make sure that chain link appears. If you don't see it, just click to the right of this box and it should turn on. Or if you're in a version of Photoshop CS6 or below, just make sure Constrain Proportions is checked at the bottom here. By checking that, it'll force it to scale evenly. So if I were to make this, let's say, 1000 wide instead of 3000 wide, so 1000 by 1333, I hit OK. It'll take a little bit here just to resize the document. And once it's done, I'll show you why the blur effect is actually quite important to keep an eye on. So here it went ahead and resized it, but when it resizes the document, it doesn't automatically readjust the power of the overall Gaussian blur on your objects. Sonar type is very blurry along with the frame. If you want to change this effect, just make sure you go into those blurs. So I have frame 2 open right here. I'll zoom in a little bit closer so we can see a little bit better. Make sure you open up the filter box by clicking on the down arrow just to the right of these 2 circles. Double click on Gaussian Blur, make sure preview is checked, and then we can reduce our radius from 4 down to something where it looks a little bit more sharp. I'll just hit 2 here so we have a nice even number to work with. And then do the same thing on this art folder just below the frames called Art Don't Remove Layer. Just check that down arrow, double click on Gaussian Blur. We used 2 before, so I'll hit 2 again, and you can see that it sharpens up our type quite nicely. So that's it for the instructions here. Hopefully the instructions were nice and clear, but if you have any further questions, do not hesitate to ask either on the comments of this video or on the actual product page of Creative Market. You can also send me a message on Creative Market. I'll be happy to help. But thanks for watching, and I hope you have a lot of fun with this product.